Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is Mike Weaver and I'm excited to join you for today's session. Before we get started, there are just a couple of things to run through for optimal listening. For everyone, all lines are currently muted and will be throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to send them using the questions feature in the right toolbar of GoToWebinar. We'll try to handle all questions at the end, but if we miss your question, we'll try to follow up in the next couple days. This session is being recorded and a link will be shared to all registered attendees right after. With that, let's hop into it. So I'm really happy that you're able to join us today. My name is Mike Weaver. I'm the Director of Enterprise Migrations here at Quadratech, and I'm the product owner of Cloud Commander, our tenant-to-tenant migration product. And here I help plan some of our large and complex multi-tenant projects, including a real monster project, which I've also worked with Julian on, of 137 tenants to one. I also have served as an adjunct professor and have done extensive work in various learning management platforms. Julian Stefan is a senior consultant on the delivery team here at Quadratech. He serves as one of our project leads for our tenant-to-tenant migration solutions. This includes planning and executing multi-tenant consolidations using Cloud Commander, as well as advising on the process and impacts to our customers. Julian has also worked on some of our most complex university projects, so he's a good person to have on today. So Julian, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. This is a topic that myself and you have dealt with our larger customers in this space very well, and I'm very excited to get into this topic today.
Great. So today, this is our agenda. So we're going to talk about how we got here. So why are we in this situation of multi-tenants in education? What are the issues and why this has changed with COVID-19? How does the tenant consolidation process work? What do you need to do to prepare your faculty and staff for the transformation? When is the right time to do it? How can you do this on a budget? And where can this go wrong? And again, if you have questions as we go, please submit them in the question feature. Just before I hop in, I'm just going to briefly go over in less than 90 seconds here what we do here at Quadratech. Here at Quadratech, we help organizations migrate and transform into Office 365. We have a migration arm of products, which is mailbox migration, archive systems like EMC Source One and Veritas Enterprise Vault, and PST files into Office 365, as well as journals, mailbox journals, and bringing them back into Office 365 and the native Exchange product. In the Grow and Adapt section, that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is organizations that are doing tenant consolidation or growing through merger, acquisition, or divestiture. And then finally, in the Optimize piece, we have our Nova management platform, which helps organizations manage Office 365 through reporting, security, and audit analytics, management, delegate administration, and more. So if any of those are of interest, go ahead and get in touch, and we'll try to help you the best we can. But let's start with how do we get here? When we talk about the multi-tenant problem, this has started for years with on-prem systems and has moved into the cloud world. Traditionally, many institutions kept faculty and staff separate, and this was for good reason. You wanted looser security on your tenant or your student environment and stricter security on your faculty and staff tenant. As data privacy laws around the world have gotten stricter and stricter, this has kind of forced this delineation and has really made it stronger, where faculty have to protect more and more data as part of their world. This also meant that on-prem systems were set up this way too. So it was very common for the on-prem environments to have a faculty and staff network that was protected and had different rules and restrictions, and then a looser student network either in on-prem housing or whatever it may be, keeping that area separate. When we talk about moving to the cloud, Microsoft for years provided really good license incentives for student faculty in Office 365. And this was part of their strategy to go after the education market, but also to grow and get a lot more experience in the space. So a lot of institutions were early adopters of Office 365, and it was easier to place all the students in one of these tenants. And quite frankly, a lot cheaper because you didn't have to provide any of that functionality. So it was a real good win early on. When these cloud systems were newer, it was a good fit for students, but we weren't quite ready for faculty to end up out there either. Just like organizations didn't first adopt into Office 365, a lot of our faculty and staff environments were on-prem. This was because the security options, a lot of cases, were all or none. So if I was really strict on my tenant, that was for everybody. And that really didn't work in the university space or education space. IT confidence wasn't as high. We're still kind of a little leery about the cloud And at the time, student data, I think, had a little bit of a different feeling towards it. It was important, but it wasn't as essential as it is today. The other aspect is, although Office 365 was in the cloud, our faculty and staff systems were not really cloud-based. So student management systems, whatever it may be, those really weren't cloud applications. So I still had to have an on-prem footprint. We're a little leery, and it just wasn't right to do that adoption. This is no longer the case. And so a lot of organizations, though, when they went to Office 365, they still kept those tenants separate because it was easier in a lot of cases. When we talk about COVID-19, distance learning isn't new. Many institutions I know I've taught online and attended online, that isn't new. But what's changed is because we rapidly have to do live learning, synchronous versus asynchronous learning at this scale is completely new. When we talk about traditional online classes, we're talking about self-paced, where the student comes into the learning management system, Blackboard, whatever it may be, downloads a document, takes a test, uploads it. That all worked very well. We're in COVID-19, we're completely different because now we're doing live remote learning kind of as the norm. So for traditionally in the past, we'd have an occasional online meeting through WebEx or whatever it might be. Now it's normal. So classes Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9:30 in the morning, we have a live session. Because of that, we need to be able to do instant document sharing and collaboration. Students are working in real time. These learning management systems don't really allow for dual editing and the kind of modern collaboration that we're used to. This also means that faculty and students are live collaborating as well, and that's new and happened very, very rapidly. Because of this, we've been able to adopt things like Microsoft Teams and other technology very, very quickly, but there really are some issues when we start looking at the multi-tenant environments that we're seeing today. So when we talk about the multi-tenant challenge, again, faculty and students, are a lot of cases, are on separate tenants because the collaboration is so much better when the students and faculty are together. This is causing a couple things that we're seeing in a lot of these environments. Faculty get two accounts. So some organizations have given just done the two account model. So faculty have an account in the faculty and staff tenant, and they have one in the student tenant, and that allows them to keep control of these spaces and do certain functions, creating teams, creating channels, whatever it needs to be. But then again, that gets really confusing and that can create a lot of help desk volumes. And when we talk about people really being in a lot of change right now with COVID-19, that can be an additional burden on our faculty, and it's just not intuitive. The other options aren't intuitive either. So faculty join the student tenant as guests, but that's not really as ideal because they don't truly have control. It's difficult to collaborate. They can't see everything, and it puts a lot of administration on somebody else to administer the student tenant and get everyone in the right place. It's just not natural. The other option is for students to join the faculty tenant, and this I think is becoming more popular, but then the students and faculty don't get the optimal collaboration that they want in this new remote world. And really when we talk about this, we're trying to take down the barriers between our collaboration and allowing for our faculty and students to just naturally work together. And unfortunately, with this drastic change very quickly, it's created some challenges. When we talk about migration challenges, student data is still important. So student data, I think back many years ago, we used to wipe the servers over the summer and do things like that. That's no longer the case. As our modern world has changed, so has coursework and the expectation of our students that coursework is cumulative. We always had some courses that were cumulative, but our digital needs are cumulative as well. So the course that I took last semester, I need that data for the next year or two because they all build on each other. As a student, I want to keep my notebooks, documents, presentations, Excel files, coding projects from all my academic career. I want that together because I may reuse it or need it differently or reference something. So I need to have that data and I just can't abandon it in an old tenant. I have to move it. Personal student data can be critical. As students, we think about in the career world that our jobs are everything, and for our students, their data is everything as well. And as they transform into trying to get a job, they need this data, and there can be a lot of personal data as well. So abandoning it again isn't meeting the expectations that our modern students have. We can also guide them in doing self-migration, but we know that that takes a lot of communications, and if anything gets missed, that can be really uncomfortable. And again, when we're trying to reduce barriers and be more of a customer service minded institution, that can be a problem. So at the end of the day, we come back to a tenant-tenant migration needs a lot of planning and execution and needs a lot of focus to do so. And that's where today Julian's going to go into some of those aspects.
Okay, so as far as how does tenant consolidation work? So, there's a process behind kind of the story of where we're from where we get from our starting point to our ending point. So the three big pillars that we typically communicate are the planning phase, the moving your data, and the management of moving your data, and your post migration needs. In reality, the planning is the biggest part of the story. So it's one of the things that we highly emphasize in this process is the three P's: plan, plan, plan. The planning of your migration and taking in all the use cases for your students and your faculty and taking their needs into consideration for what they're going to experience in the migration is the biggest part of the story that you need to hit, and can in most cases will deem whether your migration is a success or a failure, besides the technical challenges that you would experience. The, the moving of the data is, if your planning is correct, the moving of the data is actually the easiest part. The technical piece of it, which are things that you can control, that the users may not see in your precinct process. The management of the migration is things that you can manage that the users won't see, and management of the migration poster cut over for end user experience and end user support. The for large challenges that we see in our migration, so as far as the when, for when this kind of cutover is going to happen, we'll cover that in one of the later slides. The other two big points that I want to cover are the identity piece. So the identity in your tenant to tenant migration is kind of the key pillar, which it drives all the workloads that you may be moving during your migration. So for any workloads that you're moving, the identity piece is going to be key, especially for kind of a university scenario where it's not your typical enterprise environment where you may have full control of management over your devices. It's going to be, a lot of it's going to be, bring your own device. So your students are going to have their own laptops and mobile devices. Your faculty may fall into that depending on how much control you have of the faculty PCs on campus. The other key pillar of this is just the end user process and the communication. So as I mentioned earlier, the communications to your end users and what to expect and all the scenarios that they're going to experience is the other key pillar in these kind of migrations. So delving into the identity piece, when we talk about identity, and a lot of times in these kind of scenarios, when you have students and faculty that are going to come together into one big tenant family, there's going to be a domain move involved in this migration process. It's very time consuming and needs to be done very carefully. Replicating the identities correctly over into your target tenant is going to be one of the key things that you need to plan and execute correctly early on. A lot of this is going to be a lot of your planning and testing is making sure that your identities are correct. So things like making sure that the objects in the target tenant are there, making sure that all the licenses for the workloads that you're going to move are licensed properly. Making sure, for testing purposes, logging on as a test user to make sure that, setting up their workloads and migrating some test data and testing out that experience to what you can gather from what your students and faculty will experience are some of the key things that, that we like to cover with our customers in their functional and end user testing. The other scenario that you need to account for in the identity piece, and I kind of reflected on this earlier, is you need to handle disabling of the source object. So in a typical enterprise environment, we've seen scenarios where your PCs and your mobile devices are they can be managed by they could be managed by some provider, Intune, for example, where you may have conditional access rules in place that say, you know, that I can't access any of my Office 365 workloads unless, they're a managed device, on-prem and Azure with kind of a hybrid joined device, or my mobile device is fully managed. In the education space, like I mentioned earlier, may not be the case for most of your devices. So a lot of this is going to be, bring your own device. So when the students are logged in, that's one of the things that we've seen that we hammer on is, one of your common help desk calls, maybe student calls in and says, I can't log on to my services after my migration. Is my data missing? Have I been blocked off? Why can't I log in? And a lot of this in times is that they may have some cache credentials where they're still logging on to the old source tenant and they're not pointed over to the target tenant. So one of the key things that you need to handle in your identity piece on your migration weekend is executing initiate sign out before your domain's actually ejected to limit those kinds of issues. From an end user standpoint, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, for unmanaged devices, this is going to be very common for students. There's going to be a bit of work involved in getting them up and running. So initiating sign out of the device, is going to solve a good amount of the end user as long as you validated all their data has been migrated. Providing proper communication and catching all the use cases that you can potentially think of from just acting as a student and acting as a faculty. That's one of the key things that I tell my customers in migrations is act as the your user base better than most. Act how they're going to try to act. If they're a student, what are the common things that they're going to want to make sure that are still there? If they're faculty, what are the things that they access the most, or they commonly would use to make sure that it's actually there come Monday and they can actually sign in correctly. So providing that detailed documentation for any use cases that you can identify is very important, especially from the mobile device standpoint, because that could be come Monday morning before they access their their PC or Mac. The first thing that they may look at is email, for example, on their mobile device. That may be one of the first things that they look at. So the mobile device portion of it is very key. So from an Outlook and Exchange standpoint, so the Outlook profile is going to need to be reconfigured to point over to the target tenant instance, even if the email address is the same. You still need that reconfiguration to point over to your target instance. OneDrive and SharePoint are, in this case, is very key because a lot of the collaboration between students that may be in a team project, or if they're collaborating with faculty, prior to their migration, if their tenants were separate, it's their documents that they were being shared would be external links, and anything that they were sharing out with their students internally would have been internal links. Those links don't get recreated because the identity behind the identity behind the users that were shared behind that link is different because it's in a new tenant. So the document sharing links will need to be recreated. That's one of your very key points that you need to put into communication out to your end users. On the Teams workload, the client does need to be reconfigured, but you still should see all your teams post the migration move. The users will need to reactivate their click to run office bits, because since you are pointed over to a new tenant, it's still a new license SKU across your target tenant. So the reactivation piece is very key, and the signing out of one of the points that I've been trying to hammer out is for the initiating sign out on the source tenant. That's going to be very key to make sure that your reactivation of the office client runs correctly, so that it can actually point to the target tenant and not still trying to point over to the source. So there are some reset scripts that can ease this, that can ease these concerns, or a self-service reset tool that we also provide as part of our migrations. So on timing, so when is the right time to perform these kind of migrations, and how can this be done on a budget? From a timing standpoint, what we've seen is that student accounts tend to be very smaller compared to your corporate and your faculty or staff accounts. You know, emails we've seen where, you know, a lot of the use cases where if, you know, for students for email, they may have forwarding rules set up where they may forward to their, you know, their personal account versus logging onto their Outlook EDU account for email. OneDrive may be, depending on how much use of OneDrive that they use, you know, that's besides email, OneDrive may be the biggest consumption as far as what they're actually using for storage. However, you know, lots of small accounts, you know, have challenges. So, you know, especially from an email standpoint, you know, if they have a lot of, they're very small emails with a lot of items, you know, that's, you know, things to kind of look out for when you're moving your data, because sometimes that can actually take a longer time to move for the number amount of items you have that may actually be small. Just incrementing through those items may actually take longer than an account that may not have as many items but has larger file sizes per those items. Finding a long weekend break is also important. So if there's, you know, in your university space, a lot of times if you're in the planning process and you're within if you're within like a month window where you have like a student break where you're in one of your 1 to 2 week breaks in between semesters, you know, that's, if you're within one of those windows, that would be very key to utilize as one of your weekends, because you could go through and do your migration. You're not going to have, you know, there's any technical challenges that you may see. It's not like you're coming in Monday morning and making sure that, you know, 90 to 95% of everything is complete and taken care of. If there are issues that you run into which cause delays in your weekend, um, you know, you have that extra kind of time to, you know, flush those out before the faculty report back. So if you have one of those long breaks that you can identify, that's very key. So your identity is going to, you know, like I said, take some time. That's the most common challenge in these migrations. As far as prioritizing your students, what we say to our customers is, if you have a priority that needs to be set, the order that we recommend is you prioritize your active students first. So whoever your active students are for that coming, you know, within your active semester or the upcoming semester, that's who you need to prioritize first to make sure they get moved over. Then you move over to your inactive students, and then your alumni and students that aren't enrolled currently in that semester. So creating a process to, you know, support your staff if they are moving, depending on who's getting consumed, is also key. And engaging the faculty for your active classes to make sure that there aren't disruptions in their teaching sessions when this migration is going on. And for budgetary purposes, I'll turn over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Julian. I think what's important to understand here as well with timing is, you know, our budgets are certainly constrained. You know, this is there's a lot of change going on with 2020 being a very difficult year with COVID. So what I think what you've got to understand is there's direct and indirect costs, and we all know this is part of our normal projects, right? We have to understand these impacts. We're talking about direct costs. There's a planning and execution, so software costs and all the project management oversight and just the effort to get this going. It is there, and we struggle sometimes in the planning to see the return on investment, particularly in harder things like indirect costs of productivity. And the one I like is reputation. Reputation risk to IT. That's a cost that can be quantified as, if things are hard, it's harder to do future projects. When you're doing these kinds of projects, particularly in the university space, you have a very different account footprint than enterprise projects. And you have a lot of accounts, but across the board, you tend to have less data. So it's really important that when you're reaching out and doing this analysis, that you come armed with utilization data so that you can give vendors, especially when you're doing software vendor quotes, a true understanding of what you have and what you don't. There are some challenges here when it comes to a lot of accounts with a little bit of data, and you've got to ensure that the software solution that you choose can handle that, because a lot of vendors in the space have actually focused on the other way around of trying to move a lot of users with a lot of data. It is a different problem, and it actually has some other challenges that come with it. So let's talk about where this can go wrong. And I think there's three things, Julian, that you and I want to cover here. Why don't we talk about the domain injection first? What are some of the challenges that you can share from your projects where this has been quite a challenge?
So from a domain injection standpoint, one of the common things that we've seen are your domain is in a, we'll just call it stuck. There's scenarios where we've seen, so you kind of your process for cleaning up your domain is you need to make sure that your email addresses or any addresses that are tied to the domain that you're moving, those need to be removed prior to when you execute your domain injection. So that could be one of the key things that, there's could be some objects that are missed. And when you go through your Azure Wizard to remove your tenant, there's unexpected, there's unexpected objects that still may have those addresses that you may need to clean up. If you're using a DirSync process, if your on identities are on-prem to sync up to Azure, there could be something with the DirSync process that isn't shut off properly that could cause that. We've also seen, even in Azure, you've done everything right on your side, but there's something that's stuck in Azure. You could see we've seen issues in the past where going through the removal process, the domain's just stuck and there's nothing wrong on your side, but then there could be something wrong on Microsoft's side, which you would engage your Premier support for that. We've seen issues where on their side, a domain controller in Azure has been, stuck, and you need support to go in and go through and handle that process for
The other thing we probably want to note here, Julian, is when we talk about domain injection, I'm realizing we probably need to just reintroduce the fact that you can only have your SMTP domain as of today in one tenant at the same time. Now, Microsoft's launched a preview program for that, but that can be quite a challenge because you kind of have to do this in bigger chunks, and that's where that domain being stuck creates quite a challenge because then you're kind of in between tenants for a period of time.
Yeah, and then also that also introduces the point of the next point is for PowerShell throttling. So if you have a very large tenant, if you're talking, tens of thousands of addresses, that's something that you also need to script out appropriately because, going in and removing your addresses via through Azure Exchange, just with the way PowerShell works is if you've got a lot of addresses, make sure that you're using, one key thing to use is make sure you're using multiple service accounts to stay under your throttling policy and throttling budget. And if you have like 20 or 30,000 addresses, for example, take that in chunks of 2 or 3,000 and run that against multiple service accounts so you're staying under that throttling policy. But that's also another key aspect that we've seen in the ejection process is removing those addresses properly and not getting throttled by PowerShell. The next
Absolutely. And then the other aspect too on that too, as well as sometimes you have to get certain exceptions. So as we talk about the other challenge there, which is identity sync, that's kind of similar to the domain injection problem where, and really I think the common theme that we're talking about here is these are things that go into planning and executing and ensuring that you're ready and that you practice these items and getting that timing as important as possible. The other aspect where this can go wrong is the end user aspect, and it's really important that we understand that there's some basic work. Julian, as you mentioned in your section there, we don't have control over student devices typically. So they have to do something during this migration on Monday morning to get into the new combined tenant. Where have you seen that go wrong? I know we've gotten some complaints and we've done some self tools to help, but why don't you share in some of your projects what you've seen?
From what I've seen is, if a user's trying to access if a student's trying to access their email, they may see their email in their profile, but then they keep getting login prompts to log into Outlook and make sure that it authenticates correctly to get to their email, and that could be to an issue I tied to earlier where if you're moving your same address over and the user's signing in under their same address and they're not signed out of their source tenant properly because could be some identity caching that's stuck on their machine. That's been one of the common help desk calls that the help desk has to deal with. So making sure that that portion of it's taken care of is very key. So as kind of Mike mentioned earlier, this is kind of different in the university space where this isn't a typical enterprise environment where where you have your PCs managed by some kind of identity provider or MIM provider. You have these BYOD scenarios where you're depending on the end users to do something, and in a lot of enterprise environments, that's one of the key things in that kind of planning process. You try to take away having the end user do anything if possible, just to not have that have that scenario kind of kick in and cause complications in your migration process. So that is something that you need to help your end users out with in communications, and that's key to also help out your help desk to control their help desk volumes as well.
Great. Thanks, Julian. Thanks for the advice. So this is a good time for question and answer period. If you do have questions, please submit them in the right toolbar. We've got a couple that have come in, so we'll address those right now. So Mary's question is, Mary asks, is it realistic to do this over a long weekend? This seems like this takes a lot of time. And why don't I start that one off? So I think when we're talking about migration, there's a pre-sync window, the identity aspect that we've kind of given some big strong warnings on, and then the post-sync. The other thing to focus on in that, so you want to pre-sync as much data as you possibly can, and then in execution, you want to prioritize so that you can meet those windows. So if you do lose some of your window associated with those identity challenges, you're meeting that Monday morning, at least for your active students, and then you can kind of come back to the other aspects of it.
Right. And in a long weekend scenario, the thing that you don't want to deal with or keep an eye on is making sure that a good chunk of your data is still migrating. If you plan your pre-sync window correctly, most of your data is going to already be synced. You're more or less worried about the identity portions cutting over. So the time that you want to bank on in case something does go awry is you want to make sure that the data is there, but you're more dealing with the identity piece and not having to worry about a lot of your data is still syncing. Because if you do plan it right, most of your data will be synced, and that final delta sync of data will not take that long to complete.
And then Jerry asked, can I move users in batches? Do I have to move everyone all at once? And I think where this gets difficult is I think you can prioritize users, but the first limitation is a domain. The domain, you can only have the domain in one tenant at a time until this feature is spanned out. But even when the feature is out from Microsoft to span that in multiple times, grouping users becomes really difficult. So you have to do this kind of Venn diagram of keeping everybody together. So in the enterprise world, it's keeping work teams together. So gone is the day of a department only working within their department. We're now hybrid organizations working across an organization. In the student world, it's kind of always been that way. I have students across multiple schools taking multiple courses, and grouping users can actually be quite a challenge. So I think you'll find yourself far more successful in limiting impact to, instead of taking the focus on breaking users into batches, is actually doing the prioritization. So your active students are going first, your inactive students go second, and then people like alumni or other challenges, or perhaps old courses and old teams and old SharePoint sites come over last.
Right. And it also delves into your students that are working, even your students in your bachelor's or their master's or even their PhD programs. Even when they're taking more concentrated classes, they still may be with groups outside of their normal department. So trying to group them by classes or by departments that you may typically try to do in an enterprise scenario by departments, that's not really you're going to find yourself and your planning challenges. You're going to kind of go down a rabbit hole where you're trying to plan out the users by school or something like that is not going to be ideal. It's better to just migrate everybody in order of active students, your inactive students, and your alumni, as we pointed out earlier.
Great. So that's all that came in for now. If you have other questions, though, please feel free to submit them in the question bar and we will reply to them after the session. If you do want to learn more, though, we do have a great ebook that we've worked on called Everything You Need to Know About Office 365 Tenant-to-Tenant Migrations. And then after the session, we'll provide a link to this recording and other related contact. This is also my email address. If you've got something direct, I can also facilitate a reply that way. Otherwise, thank you for joining. Enjoy your afternoon.